Okay, thank you. So I'm speaking actually just to a slightly adjusted title, subheading now. So in this paper, I would like to discuss how the 100 hours approach has disrupted a series of habitual research practices and consider the consequences this might have for the investigation of material culture. I'll do so with reference to my study of an object in the pathology collections at UCL, which is a plaster cast, which I think is here today, of a child's left foot, showing the results of Talipes Equino Varus, or club foot, as it's more commonly known. And this is the object positioned on a stand. And I should say that whilst I currently work in the wonderfully interdisciplinary environment of UCL's museums and collections, my training is as a social and cultural historian, and although I've always worked in and around material culture studies, the greatest part of my research to date has been archival and consequently textual. And so I'm very interested in thinking about how best to combine objects and archives in order to specifically to access the past and to ask new questions of it. So, the plaster cast, it was made, we think, sometime between 1870 and 1910. It was intended for display in a museum at the Great Ormond Street Hospital, and today it is one artefact amongst a vast collection of objects, images, textual records and human tissue specimens that relate to the hospital's 160-year history dedicated to the diagnosis and treatment of childhood diseases. The plaster foot is indeed from a child patient of the hospital. The cast was made by an artisan used to working in plaster of Paris. It was made for a medic who wished to exhibit model examples of particular pathologies in a hospital museum where they could be consulted by doctors and surgeons in training. So why is this foot at UCL and instead perhaps at the Great Ormond Street Hospital itself? In recent years, there has been some movement of medical collections between institutions, and UCL acquired a section of Great Ormond Street Hospital's collection in 2007, when it was feared that some of this material, particularly human tissue specimens, might be destroyed. Amongst this collection of pathology specimens were also 79 plaster casts, depicting a variety of childhood diseases, and these are a lot of them. Some will be more familiar than others, possibly. So it's worth pointing out at this juncture that in relation to many of the other objects you will hear about today, my plaster cast can be contextualised really quite extensively within the wider collection of Great Ormond Street Hospital objects, and ultimately by the large archive of patient case notes, post-mortem records and other documentary evidence that's still held at the hospital. So my object as I encountered it was never really alone. In material terms, this cast is quite literally an impression of a one-time living being. It has an undeniable relationship with the person whose foot and medical disorder it represents. And here are some more recent versions of life casting done by an artist. Simultaneously, this cast is a model. It is a type that could be used to teach medics how to recognise this pathology in their young patients. The cast is also the product of a process of making, a craft in plaster casting that was really put to a wide range of uses in this period: artistic, decorative and educational. This object speaks to the material in terms of plaster and skin. It speaks to the spatial, a craftsman's workshop, a hospital and a museum. The intellectual in terms of the history of medical diagnosis and treatment, and also the emotional in terms of one child's suffering. It is as tactile and personal as it is distressing. There's much more to say about this object, but I would like to quickly explain why I chose this cast as my anchor point for this project. In my own research, I've understood material culture primarily through the lens of the purchase, use and experience of goods in the 18th century British home. In many respects, this plaster cast foot, which is institutionally situated, medical and pedagogical, is distinctly removed from my usual terrain. However, my choice was also influenced by an article written by Frank Trentman in 2009, in which he addressed materiality in the future of history. Trentman emphasised a perceived dichotomy within historical studies of material culture between those that had focused on, in his words, the soft world of possessions and the domestic interior, as I very much have, and the potential for the study of hard things and networks. Putting to one side the possibly gendered language in use here, Trentman's conceptualisation of historical material culture studies as being divided into hard and soft topics is mirrored somewhat in our understandings of different disciplinary approaches to the study of material things. Many historians, for example, have suggested that recent studies of material culture have really congregated around the so-called soft concerns of culture rather than the hard physical facts of the material thing itself. This same contrast in approach is broadly mapped onto the spectrum of disciplines that study material things. So in choosing this brittle little object, a picture of it, I was very conscious of its relationship with both the hard and the soft, the material and the cultural. But to me, part of the pleasure of working with objects is just this. They have the potential to bring together researchers engaged in these very different kinds of research, to bring those different perspectives and methodologies to bear on particular lines of inquiry. So the research itself, at first I followed the object's material leads, spending my time with it, looking, touching, drawing, contemplating its form and applying the frameworks that were offered through our project meetings. Once I had sustained my attention on the material for some time, I allowed myself a glimpse of the archive. And first of all, I wanted to see whether I could piece together the links between the plaster casts at UCL and the patient records at the hospital. In our records about the cast, there are a few clues, such as see Dr. Lee's casebook, 1894. There were tantalising references to photograph drawers and to Henry L., aged 9 years and 10 months. After some extracurricular hours spent in the tight confines of the Great Ormond Street archive, I had managed to locate the patient case notes of one of our plaster casts, P16. And here you can see a sort of abbreviated form of them. And they're very compelling because, of course, you get a name, you get an address, you get details of the age, you see how they came in, if they came in with family members. There's social history here, this is what attracts the eye, but there's also all of their medical treatment and what happens to them in the end. So this was all really highly satisfying, but I had a nagging feeling of guilt about how quickly I had delved into this easily readable details of the archive, possibly to the consequent neglect of my enigmatic artefact. Maybe if I could at least find P45 amongst all this paper, I could assuage my guilt. But I searched in vain. The notes for my cast only mentioned the condition itself, extreme congenital Talipes Equino Varus, and provided no further leads. So instead, I hunted through all the records I could find that referred to Talipes, the condition. Whilst this search did not reveal the child behind P45, it did help me understand what the child would have experienced in their hospital bed. The treatments for Talipes, which actually have changed really rather little since the 19th century, involved a combination of surgical intervention on the Achilles tendon, manipulation of the bones and ligaments in the foot, and applications of plaster casts. It's a rather terrible picture, but and this is from a modern source, obviously. In my ignorance about Talipes, I had not realised that my looking, touching and considering plaster had a resonance in the archive, and more specifically within that patient's experience of their treatment. For this child, plaster would have been applied with two purposes in mind: to correct the Talipes, but also to capture its form for the museum. Whilst this material connection was to some extent coincidental, I felt that by having engaged with the material presence of the plaster foot, I had inadvertently thought through some of the sensory features of that child's experience. The material had not been entirely annihilated by the archive, but instead this approach to studying the object had led me to a better understanding of the patient, despite my reading only the words of the medical practitioner. The object had effectively undermined the dominance of the medical professional's voice that would naturally triumph through the textual record. Nevertheless, I sensed that there was a rift between these two approaches to research. To be able to benefit fully from prolonged contact with material artefacts as part of this research process, I needed to unlock the tension that existed between ritualised attention on the object and a reversion to its archival context. In my own research, I've looked at letter writing as a route to intellectual life, arguing that the material practice of corresponding and the domestic ritual of writing informed the traffic of ideas in early modern Britain. To my mind, this material exchange that takes place is central to the development of ideas. So following good 18th century advice about the edifying qualities of a cultivated conversation, I decided to engage in a series of familiar conversations with friends around my object. Through a social exchange focused on the material, I wanted to make this object, as Sherry Turkle would have it, a provocation to thought. This is the third phase of my 100 hours research, which I'm currently documenting on the project website. So to sum up, many of us have struggled with not knowing our objects. For me, this not knowing stood in contrast to the quick wins of archival research. However, I had approached the archive with a clear objective in mind, whereas I had approached my plaster cast with no particular agenda, other than to explore it with my eyes and hands. But the most important thing that I've found is that by working collaboratively and across disciplines, it is possible to create an environment capable of confronting and potentially resolving absences of understanding. Moreover, going through this process of not knowing and struggling with the material evidence of an object is generative because it disrupts our usual patterns of research, which are often direct and expedient, and forces one to rely on exchanges with others, be they objects or friendly collaborators. For me, 100 Hours has shown the potency of combining sustained attention on material things with a social ritual of interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary exchange. It will certainly change my research practice for the better.